Corsten, welcome. Great to have you here.
Nice to be here.
We're in Area 31 of IE Business School, and I wanted to get you here to talk about scaling, and particularly the idea of operations and scaling. Because I'm someone who's an entrepreneur, I've started businesses, and I'm here doing this course in IE called the Owners Management Program, all about how entrepreneurs can scale. In other words, how they go from the startup to the scale up. And one day you came to me when I was sitting drinking coffee in the rest, and what did you say to me?
Well, first of all, I said hello.
Yes.
Because that's what I usually do when I meet somebody
Rather
like
than
you.
Guten Abend or something.
Exactly.
You said hello.
No, seriously. You see, I have been interested in startups and scale-ups for a while, and I actually participated in some fairly high-profile scale-ups that unfortunately didn't make it through because of all the problems, particularly operational problems. So when you talked about scaling, I just said, boy, we have to get together and talk about this, because I think after what I've read and after what I've experienced, I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't realize what a role operation plays in scaling.
Okay. So this is the idea that, because we know about the lean startup movement, we know that 10 years ago there was hardly anyone really knew anything about entrepreneurship. Before Steve Blank came along and explained to us that, listen, startups are not just small businesses of large companies. There was very little about lean scale up. There was very little about the lean canvas. There was very little, and that has come on so much. We all know about experimentation. We all know about the importance of getting out and meeting customers. So the next stage then is, what are we going to do about scale-ups, because there's still such a huge failure rate among startups. We still see lots of people who start and they get some traction, but then they fail when the process word comes in. In other words, when they have to move from being what I call hunters to being farmers. So this is why the discipline of operation is really interesting to me. And as soon as you said it to me, I started to think, exactly, because there's like 50, 60 years of operational theories looking at these kind of things about time, looking about demand and supply, and all of these things. So from the moment you said it to me, I thought this was really interesting. And I've started to talk to entrepreneurs, and I've started to talk to scale-up companies, and as soon as I mentioned it, they were like, yes. But problem is, it took us 12 months to work this out. So what I'm trying to do now, both in the Owners Management Program and also whenever people who are having difficulty with this scale-up phase of business, is say, right, first thing is operations. Okay, so we have to get into operations. So maybe you could start by sort of talking to me about operations, and what are the early things you would say to any scale-up entrepreneur who came to you and said, well, how can operations help me?
Well, actually, let me go one step back. Because one thing that makes me almost, I'm a professor, but I do get emotional about things. And one of the things that really makes me almost angry is that there is this saying that a startup should be lean. Yeah. And that makes me really uncomfortable. And the reason for this is actually going back in the history of operations. Because I think a startup should not be lean. It cannot be lean, as a matter of fact. And why is that the case? Well, the term lean comes from the Japanese automotive industry. It was actually something that was developed when researchers went to look at Toyota and try to find out, how does Toyota work? And they looked at the Toyota production system. And then they realized a good way to describe what Toyota is doing is to call it lean. That was a very clever marketing ploy. Now, lean, if you think about Toyota, comes from an environment that is, predictable, efficient, where through years and years of work and Kaizen and improvement, you eliminate all the waste. So it runs like a smooth machine, but it's very repetitive. It's standardized. But hey, entrepreneurs, startup, they're the opposite. They're not standardized. They're not repetitive. It's all new. And so I think the word lean in the context of startup is a misnomer. Now, obviously, if you think about lean as a metaphor for good, and a lot of people actually think about lean as a metaphor for good management, okay, can't be wrong then. Yeah. But if you look at it from the original point of view, then a startup cannot be lean. It has to be wasteful because it pivots all the time. It has to have all these options that it tries until it finds the perfect product market fit. So that was just my initial reaction to you, because it really is one of these things that me, as an operations professor with some startup and scale-up experience, really angers me.
So what you're saying is, obviously you don't waste money. You should never waste money. But in other words, you have to leave something to later optimize.
You need slack.
Yeah.
You need slack. You need to, we all know that it's about pivoting. And pivoting means that you have enough slack to actually be able to pivot, right?
Yeah.
So there's a bit of a contradiction. But let's not talk too much about that, because I understand that the intention of the people that talk about lean is all good.
Yeah.
And I truly support the intention. I'm just not so happy with the word lean.
Okay.
But let's open it up, because you talked about what operations can actually bring to scaling up entrepreneurship. Yeah. So let's start a little bit about operations. Early on, operations was related to manufacturing. Then it started to move into services. And then somebody had an idea to say, well, actually, operations is about processes. But we didn't stop there. There's a new philosophy out there that says operation management is actually about matching supply with demand.
Okay.
In an uncertain world.
Right.
Now, the key thing is matching supply with demand and the uncertain world, because it is uncertainty that makes the matching of supply and demand so difficult. So let's assume you have a great idea. You have the product, the disruptive whatever product we all think about, which means that your demand goes through the roof. It ideally grows exponentially, as we all hope.
Yes.
But then you have this stupid supply system, which is the opposite. While demand is all volatile and growing, the supply system is all rigid and slow, and it requires stepwise investments, and it's really costly to improve. And so how do you match this? Yeah. Now, a lot of people think, we need better forecasts. But hey, forecasts are notoriously wrong, particularly as a pundit says, when they concern the future. So what you have to do is you have to do a sober analysis of the demand and kind of like build in a lot of forecast error, because that's what operations folks always include in this. And you have to somehow create a structure, and there's some models for that, how you can grow your supply system in sync with it. Yeah. Now, when I mean supply, by the way, I don't think about, trucks and whatnot. I think about everything. Capacity. I think about how many people do you need. A lot of the time that I spend teaching in class is about, well, let's assume you have a new business. How many people do you need? Yeah. Well, people look at that. I'm like, I don't know. I say, well, we can actually provide you with some guidance. We look at the work that you do. We found out how much time it takes. We figure out how many heads that means. We project this into the future. And boy, there we go. And what I see happening in reality is, we'll just look at how much money we have, and then we'll hire the smartest people, because we don't know what's going to happen.
2 of these and 4 of these and 7 of these. Yeah.
Well, we can do better than that. So when I think about supply and capacity, I think about people. I think about facilities. Yeah. I think about IT. I think about all these things. And boy, there's decades of research of people who try to dimension the supply system to match this with this volatile demand that we want this volatile demand. But boy, if you win the jackpot, what do you do then? Yeah. We got some answers.
Yeah, because one of the things, and I know, most of the companies that we have here studying at IE in the Owners Management Program, most of the things we have are they're not the Apples and the Inditexes and these kind of guys. They're literally people who have been struggling away to get a product market fit, and then they get one, and that's great. But then they are trying to operationalize and put in process and all of these things. And one of the things I say to them is that the really great companies that have grown, it's because of their logistics capability. That if you look at Apple and Inditex and even Netflix and these companies, that they have in their senior management someone who understood operations. Now, no one ever talks about that. Everyone talks about the design guy, and everyone talks about the manufacturing guy, but no one talks about the operations guy. And that for me is a really interesting insight. And that you use words like supply and demand, not in a kind of, that's just economics or anything like that. But again, as you say, that there's 50 years of operations research into this, and too many entrepreneurs we see, their businesses are failing to scale up because they don't take the time to really understand, and I mean, you've practical examples of that. I mean, you've spoken to companies about trying to kind of, have you ever tried to model this, and what did they say to you?
Lots of questions, Joe.
Yeah.
Just a few points here. Obviously, the companies that have scaled well, that we all admire, somewhere there was a really old expert, the senior guy who knows operations. Think about Google, Eric Schmidt, more or less was, the chief operating officer, president, or whatever role he played officially, but he was the guy who knew what to think about in the long term. And you had the two smart guys, the guys who were the inventors, Sergey, the founders, and Larry, they had these good ideas, and Eric was able to, you know, put the rubber on the road.
Yeah.
Sheryl Sandberg, Facebook. There's many examples of that, okay? So that's something you have to consider. Now, the problem is, and let me tell you that, this is one of the things, I must admit something. I actually did my PhD in marketing.
Right.
So which means I used to hang out with the crazy guys.
You can't tell me this 10 minutes into the video.
Of course I can tell you that. I can tell you that whenever I want in the video. No, seriously, I did my PhD in marketing, and I hung out with all, you know, the advertising guys, with the creative guys.
Yeah.
But then I realized this was a little bit too, sorry to say, my friends from marketing, I felt this wasn't, you know, grounded enough. And then I started looking into operations, and I realized that there's almost like a divide. There's the creative people, you know, the entrepreneurs, the creative people, and there's the operational people, the things
the
that
right
get
brain
done.
and left
And there's
brain.
somehow there's a divide.
Yeah.
And there's this notion that operations is not sexy.
Yeah.
And you know, it doesn't really matter whether it's sexy or not, it has to be done, right? So if you're an entrepreneur and you don't like operations yourself,
Yeah, you got to do something else.
Get somebody who likes it. Get somebody who likes it. Get a Tim Cook.
Yeah.
Get somebody on the side. You are the crazy creative guy.
Yeah.
But boy, if you don't have a process to get the product in the market, well, it'll never be a success. You won't scale. So if you don't like to do the job, get somebody to do the job. But it better be somebody who understands the nitty-gritty of execution. And execution is about processes. Creating repetitive processes, even if it's perhaps boring to document them.
Yeah.
Creating, you know, understanding where's the bottleneck. Finding out what stops you from growing more. Is it people? Is it the call center? Is it the product? Is it the leadership? You know, be open, right?
Yeah.
That's what you need. Somebody to have, with this experience, to ask these kind of questions about how to get the rubber on the road.
Yeah, the amount of times I speak to companies, and again, it's the standard for the guy who did a brilliant job as a survivalist to kind of get the thing off, but can't transition into the scale-up phase. I ask them about like dashboards, you know, what numbers do they track, KPIs, all this kind of stuff, and very often I get very incomplete answers. Either they're too many or too few. In other words, some people the best cases of scaling I've seen around this idea of a unifying metric, a single metric they were going after. But I was talking to a guy yesterday who said, like, we track like 150 different things. And I thought, like, God, that's too many. So you have people that are overdoing this as well as underdoing it. You know?
Well, the word KPI stands for key performance indicator. There can't be more than 12 or whatever key performance indicators. But as we all know, the indicators are just, you know, that's just the hindsight mirror, right? That's the back mirror. They only show you what you did. So I think it's really important to have the processes in place so that what you get out at the end of the day in these indicators is the right thing. So I think, but when you say that, more generally speaking, scale-ups don't have the right management systems in place, absolute agreement. Boy, but it's a challenge. You know, you're the entrepreneur. You have 7 heads. You got to be creative. You got to hold the company together. You got to do the HR. You got to talk to the funders. And so on all the list of priorities, somewhere down the line says, like, make sure that, you know, everything runs smoothly, that there's oil in the machine. That's just one of the things. Look, an entrepreneur would love to do this, but unfortunately, with the limited time that he has, it's just down on his priority list. But it's one of these things that just had to get done. So I think there is a need to establish something. And again, I've seen these companies that have been doing this well, and they had somebody in there that was actually somebody who liked to do this. And then with this passion of somebody who would actually like to see how these things actually get implemented, that's how you can do it.
Okay, interesting. So what other things then should we talk about? What other things would be useful to this person who's facing this challenge of moving from a kind of a startup to a scale-up environment? What other things should we really be talking about?
Well, I think one thing that's interesting is that when you are in a startup mode, you need optionality. But it's actually, it's actually painless, because if you're a startup and you pivot and you try something new, the cost of doing this is very low, you know, because you're a startup, you're a small group of people, so you can try a lot of things.
Yeah.
But then when you go to scale-up mode, and by the way, the hardest thing is obviously to find out when do you start scaling.
Yeah.
And there's lots of fun stories. Let me tell you one of the stories I've been involved with is that there were a bunch of first orders, and obviously they were getting bigger and bigger, and we thought this was going to continue.
Yeah.
So we said, boy, we're starting to scale. And then a couple of months later, we realized this was just a little bonfire, but it didn't last. So we thought we were scaling, but we weren't. So it's very hard to find out when you're actually transitioning. But when you transition, when you have that market fit, then the next thing is you have to kill all the other options. Just go with one thing. So you should go for focus. And that's something that is hard, because before your mindset was all around trying and experimenting, and now you have to abandon all of that and just execute on one thing. And on top of that, from an operational point of view, the dilemma is you should focus, yet on the other side, you still need slack. Because from now on, you will be perhaps growing faster than you imagined. So you always have to make sure that your capacity, your supply, grows a little faster than your demand, or at least in synchronization, because otherwise you have the demand going through the roof, but you have no product, you have no service. Your IT system is a disaster, your call center gets swamped with all sorts of calls, nothing's going right, and then all of a sudden this can backlash, because yes, customers can be patient, but they can be very impatient as well. So if you have a really good product and you can't get it up there because you're failing to provide the necessary capacity, inventory, whatever infrastructure, that's not good.
Okay, so what we're seeing then is companies who sort of in the startup stage experiment, a whole pile of experiments, trying different things, and then they start to see engagement. They start to see lots of people, you know, passing the toothbrush test or using their product every day, or rapid engagement. Now, the first thing, as you say, is you have to be careful to, you know, move between the signal and the noise. There might be an unintended reason why that's happening, and you have to be careful not to start prematurely scaling. So that's the first thing you watch for. You get engagement, and you have to make sure that it isn't something, a random factor that is encouraged. But then you do pass into the stage, and then you have to, instead of having 12 experiments, pick the one best, or even perhaps two that work, and double down, triple down, quadruple down, and really focus on that. And that's when, like, the scale starts to happen. That's when, you know, is that the kind of thing you would, you know, to explain it? Is that the kind of thing we say?
Absolutely, but it's hard. Because, you see, it means saying no. And I know, for instance, in retailing, how many retail startups try to diversify because it's easy. It's easy to add and add, particularly if you think about somebody like Amazon, who seems to have been adding all the time and win. But actually, it can also happen that your concept gets watered down and people don't know what you stand for. So Amazon, it worked, but for others, it doesn't work. So you have to stick to your knittings, and you have to say no to many things. And that's what you call doubling down. Absolutely right, but doubling down sounds very positive, but I see sort of the dark side of this. It means that you have to sit together and, as a team, or perhaps as a CEO, say no to many options that you could pursue. Because if you have too many options, people don't know what you're standing for. That's one thing. But just the scaling up will not happen because you cannot produce so many things at once. You cannot manage so much variety at once.
But then again, I'm just this flashing in my eyes, all the conversations I've had where guys get really worried about doing this because they go, if I double down or triple down, and paradoxically, the risk in scaling is greater than at startup, because like if you could, you know, open offices and you know, sort of expand on products or something, and if something goes wrong, then you're more at risk. And people very often think in terms of like getting through a funding round or something, and then they get through a funding round and think, oh, the old days of struggling or day to day, I'm like a proper company now. And that's why they're reluctant to like double down or triple down, that the risk when you're scaling is greater, but that's effectively what you have to do. But that's why it's so hard to do it.
As a startup, your risk of failure is what it does to your ego. If you fail, you lose a little bit of money, you have to tell your friends, I started something, it wasn't a really good idea. But if you fail, you can actually fail quietly. There's not much noise. If you fail when you scale, after you received a bit of money, a couple of millions, whatever, you fail spectacularly. And everybody talks about it. And so there's a bit of this. So actually, as you said, scaling is much riskier, because when you are a startup, nobody expects you to be profitable. You're just a startup. You're an idea. You're a project. When you scale up, you have all these people looking at you. The suppliers want their bills paid. The funders want, you know, their X's or whatever in returns. The founders, you know, the customers, everybody's looking at you. The pressure is so much higher.
Yeah. The other interesting thing, I'm just, the ideas are coming into my head as we're talking. The other thing then is this idea of like good, quick and cheap, which I believe is called the magic triangle, although you know more about this. And the trade-off between those things, because what engineers learn, and my background is in engineering, is like you can have any two. So you can be good and quick but not cheap, or you can be, you know, good and cheap but not quick. But you know, is it possible to do all three?
It's not easy. Let's say like this. It actually raises another thought, and I don't want to forget the one. I'll get to that magic triangle.
I'll bring you back, don't worry. Yeah.
I'll get to that in a second. It's actually there's this obsession with speed in the scale-up community. It's like as if there was a need for speed's sake.
Yeah.
But it's good to be fast, but fast and bad quality is worse than slow, because people are not forgiving. So it seems as if there are situations, granted, where there's so much global competition out there and everybody's looking at you, you really have to run fast. The problem is you have to run fast and get it right. Mm-hmm. But in general, I think there's too much emphasis on speed. But actually, coming back to what you said, there is this idea of competing priorities. You have speed, you have cost, you have quality. And in a normal setting, people said, it's hard to be fast and produce good quality because being fast means making mistakes. On the other side, being fast and being cheap was also not possible because the idea was if you want to be fast, you throw more resources at the problem, therefore can't be costly. And you cannot have low cost and high quality because, you know, the old saying on the street goes, the cheaper, the worse the quality. But that's not true. Because if you have a disciplined approach to process management and you start by reducing the complexity, by improving the quality, you become more reliable in your processes, in your execution. Now, if you're more reliable in your execution and in your processes, you actually become more dependable. And if you're more dependable, you will get things right the first time. And if you get things right the first time, you will actually be faster because a lot of good time is wasted by reworking. So if you get things right the first time, you'll get faster. And if you get faster, you'll get cheaper. Yeah. So actually there is a new thing in the operations community. It's not new. It's been around for 30 years. It's called the sand cone model, which shows that if you want to be fast and cost effective, you have to start on the bottom by making sure the processes are right. Now, transferring this to the scale up, you should be fast, but if you are fast but you make mistakes, you lose so much time. So it's better to spend a little bit more time thinking and planning and getting in some people from a practical point of view, some people with a, sort of a Six Sigma black belt, or a few people who actually look at what everybody's doing, saying like, look, I've looked at this for a while and I think we can do better. I noticed, Jack's doing it like this, Joe's doing it like this, and Peter's doing it the third way. Actually, I find this is not efficient. Let's do it the way Peter does it. And Jack and Joe, you'll learn from Peter how to do this, and then you can do this. Now, this requires a moment of reflection, but in this rush to be the fastest. Look, scaling is a marathon. It's not a 100-yard dash. Mm-hmm. So you have a little bit of time to work on the way you run because it's a marathon and not a 100-yard dash.
I mean, I use this phrase, and my students all know this idea of, like a day in the library will save you 6 months in a lab. In other words, sometimes either talking to someone or taking that moment to try and work out prior experiences can beat, just kind of doing a charge mentality and like heading out in there.
Oh yeah, run against the wall, get up and run against the next wall. That's very inefficient.
Yeah, but that I understand why in a startup situation people do that, because there's, it's just survival. It's keep your head above water. But that's one of the things you have to change. It's one of the things where because your decisions have bigger consequences.
I'm not even sure that the startup is about survival.
Yeah.
If you think about it, there is actually almost no metric when you're a startup. You just have to it's about effectiveness. It's about getting the right product market combination out there. Now, obviously you need some money in order to get it and work on this, but most of the times the nucleus of this is not millions and millions and millions.
Yeah.
The problem is scaling is actually about survival. It's not about profitability. You know, if you are in a fast scale up, you don't think about profitability. Amazon still barely thinks about profitability. It's just about survival. And only after the demand, you know, gets a little bit more predictable, then you can actually work on true profitability goals.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing. You have to find out what is your actual objective.
Yeah.
Because if you are not venture capital funded, if you actually have the good old-fashioned ways you get money from a
Customers.
bank, then you actually have to be profitable. But if you have to be profitable, you can't scale that quickly because it's even harder to match supply with demand. Yeah. So you have to think about what is your funding situation, what is your, you know, what is your objective? Is it profitability because you have to return money, or is it long-term profitability, which means in the meantime it's just purely, you know, making it through the next round.
Peter Thiel says in his book 0 to 1 that, you know, companies, you know, 15 years is when they should start to think that is their profit times. And if you look at the, you know, the sort of trajectory, he says even a company like PayPal, which is a well-established company, that their glory years are still to come. In other words, that it takes like 15 years of getting through various issues, positioning yourself in an industry, all of these kind of things. So like and that's why when companies sell out too early, they let other people then make all that money, you know. So that's consistent with what you're saying.
Sometimes the truth is painful, and sometimes a little bit of self-illusion is very helpful, because all the people out there that want to scale, they hope to get there earlier.
Yeah.
Of course, because 15 years is so far away.
Yeah.
On the other side, truth of the matter is, after whatsoever 10 years, indeed things become more predictable.
Yeah.
Because even if you grow exponentially at a certain moment in time, even Walmart and whatever Amazon, they're slowing down a little bit in their growth trajectory.
Law of large numbers. Yeah.
Law of large number kicks in, and then things become more predictable, and then you can actually manage your resources in a way that you can truly be profitable.
We're here in Europe now, where I've lived for the last 12 years, and the interesting part is that I've heard this saying, I don't know how true this is, that in Europe things happen are slowly but better, whereas, you know, Silicon Valley has this kind of the blitz scaling approach, and that can be, you know, is tremendously fascinating, you know, in the same way that in a lab you look at organisms that like have a you know, a small life cycle because you can examine them from birth to death. So you know, one of the things that, you know, I tend not, I mean, I use Silicon Valley cases because of the value they create, but I also try and not use Silicon Valley cases. And a lot of the Silicon Valley cases I feel aren't applicable to the students I have before me in terms of their, you know, their problems they're trying to deal with. So, I mean, what do you think about this Silicon Valley, like this whole blitz scaling thing? What do you think we have to learn from that?
There's two elements here. I think, I'm not sure whether European startups or scale-ups are better. I think it's not up to us to judge that. It's the market to judge that. The interesting thing, however, is that the context is so different. The US is one big uniform market, 300, 400 million people, one language, one legal environment, one regulatory environment. If you get something right, if you find an inefficiency in the United States, and you get something right that addresses this, you can scale very quickly because of that. I come from Switzerland. Now, in Switzerland, it's 8 million. If you have a retail startup in Switzerland, what you target max is something like 30 stores, because that covers more or less every big city. And a big city in Switzerland is 50,000 people plus. So if you want to scale up in Switzerland versus scaling up in the US, it's very different because just the market is much smaller. The other thing is there's so many regulatory things that you have to consider. Every market has a different regulatory environment. And that's why, for instance, people get so fascinated by digital startups, because digital is usually less associated with regulatory issues. If you want to become a healthcare startup or a biotech startup or whatever, something that has some health hazards involved, it could also be a mechanical startup. There's all sorts of local administration regulations to consider. Just opening one bracket, Uber, we all know, is facing lots of regulatory issues in each country that Uber enters. And that's why their scaling stutters a little bit. Apart from other reasons, that's one of the reasons why it stutters a little bit, because they have to adjust their model to every market. Now, the US, has always been good in creating solutions that can be, pardon my language, packaged nicely. Like I wouldn't say like a detergent, but something that you can package nicely and then mass distribute across the world. And they're the best at this. As soon as you get to Europe, you need to create solutions that can be adapted to every country and still be profitable. That's a very different challenge. Now, mentioning blitzscaling, I mentioned before, I don't think there's a need for speed in every situation. For some, there is. Now, if you really believe there is a unicorn, if your capital, if your funders believe that you are really a unicorn, then go for blitzscaling.
Yeah.
But that's, how many unicorns are we talking about? 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 across the whole world, across the last 10 years?
Yeah.
So in most cases, we probably don't have to rush. And I'm not even sure that out of Europe we will get these kind of unicorns. But again, if you're an entrepreneur, a realistic entrepreneur, your ambition should perhaps not be a unicorn. Your ambition should be, in 5 years or in 10 years from now, I want to have a sustainable business that somehow is in the market that I defined, number 1, 2, or 3, or 4, or 5, and it is a sustainable proposition for my customers who found a solution to a problem that perhaps they didn't even know they had, or they had.
Yeah.
And I bring some money for my capital, for the venture capitalists or whoever gave me money. And that should be the idea. Now, obviously, there's always great energy you get out of big dreams. But if those big dreams become small dreams, but they're still realized dreams, I think your scale-up was a success.
Okay. So we're sort of wrapping up now. So I just wanted to make a few points, and then we're just going to do a quick summary of the things we've covered. So when people come to me and ask me about, I've started 6 companies and what I've learned from those, I first say to them to understand the difference between startup and scale-up. In other words, this idea of hunting and farming, this idea of, catching waves or, lighting fires or putting out fires. Then I look at their product and their service. I look at the idea of stopping experimenting and double downing on various things. Then I look at their culture, which we haven't talked much about, but is probably a huge factor. In fact, it certainly is a huge factor because every company has a culture. The decision is whether you have actually tried to shape that culture or whether you've allowed that culture to be created. And then the final thing and the most important thing is the operationals aspect. The idea of respect for process, the idea of respect for using what we know from operations in a scale-up situation where you can actually make choices which have direct decisions on the success of the company. So that's sort of the things I talk about. So in terms of what we've talked about today, what could we sort of summarize quickly maybe the 4 or 5 things that we've covered?
One more thing.
Yeah.
Culture is so important, but culture is the way we work.
Yeah.
And the way we work is also the way we defined how to work. It's not just about attitude. A lot of people think culture is about attitude, but culture is about attitude and processes. And operations helps define those processes. And then if you have the right people with the right attitude, you make these processes,
so you
shine.
Have a culture of data collection, a culture
all
of
big companies, all the companies that we admire have a certain culture. But again, culture is not just attitude. Mm-hmm. Culture is the way you work, which is defined. These are defined ways of working. Mm-hmm. So I'm all with you that culture is super important, but I think there's a lot of the culture that is defined and influenced by operations. Now, my short summary. Now, again, I think we have to open
we should definitely start with the lean point because that's the important point we need to get through.
Absolutely right. And I can go on any stage and I can get very quickly very emotional about that. But the thing is, I think operations is misunderstood. People think about forklifts, trucks, warehouses. Operations is about matching supply with demand in an uncertain world. And what more can an uncertain world be than a scale-up where you don't know what the future will be? So operations is fascinated and deals a lot with understanding demand. Mm-hmm. Marketing creates demand, we fulfill it. So we have to understand it, every little detail of the demand, because otherwise we will not be able to fulfill it. So once we start from this, we see that operations can help us understand demand and help us create a system. A management system can help us define the capacity, the inventory, the amount of people we need. How do we divide work among these people?
Yeah.
Call centers, IT systems, all of this, defining and dimensioning this in a dynamic world. That's at the core of operation management today.
Yeah, and that is something we can absolutely help people with. That is not, you know, like an art or anything like that. It's absolutely, it's a science. It's something that we can help people with. And in a way, and what I understand people who kind of make a big distinction between people who study things versus people who have actual experience, there is a huge body. Well, first of all, you have people like you and me who we run businesses as well as teaching, and that's starting to be a very common thing. But I think also we need to think in terms of that there are very definite things that you should not do. There may be some room in terms of, like, depending on the business and the country, that you know, you have to make that decisions. But, you know, in the scale-up situation, based on the companies we've looked at, we can definitely make strong statements about things you should not do, and very strong statements about things you should do.
Actually, it's normally easier to make statements about what you should not do because they have often led to definitive stops of scale-ups.
Yeah.
It's harder to define the open space.
Yeah.
It's easier to define the no-nos, but that's probably another video.
So don't get too lean. Okay, we'll run to the thing. Don't get too lean. Blitz scaling works in a certain sense, but it's not for everyone.
Exactly.
The idea of being, you know, good is super important versus
don't rush.
Yeah.
You can be fast and right if you do it in a bottom-up way.
Okay.
Focus matters.
And then focus also, the idea of experiment a whole pile of things, find something that works, and then have the confidence to double down on the thing that's working. And that's then how you'll scale.
Perfect.
Brilliant. Daniel, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joe.
It's been great.